Above the plains of Eastern Asia, entire worlds rise into the sky, isolated, silent, and often unreachable. Peaks emerge through layers of cloud like fragments of another planet. Sheer cliffs drop into valleys that sunlight rarely touches. Narrow paths, carved into vertical rock, disappear into mist. This is not a single mountain range. It is a network of landscapes shaped over millions of years by tectonic collision, erosion, and time itself. And yet, despite advances in mapping, climbing, and satellite observation, many of these places remain largely untouched. In regions like Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, stone pillars rise hundreds of meters from the forest floor, separated by voids that challenge access. On Mount Hua, a single misstep on a narrow wooden plank can lead to a vertical drop. And in the remote highlands near Mount Kailash, one of the most revered peaks on Earth, remains unclimbed, not because it cannot be reached, but because it is not meant to be. These are not simply mountains, they are boundaries. What forces created landscapes so steep, so unstable, that even modern exploration hesitates? Why do certain peaks remain untouched? Not by limitation, but by choice. And what happens when geology, climate, and belief converge to create places that resist human presence? To understand these hidden peaks is not just to map their location. It is to examine the limits of access, the weight of cultural meaning, and the physical realities that define where humans can and cannot go. The geography of isolation. China's landscape is defined not by a single mountain chain, but by a vast and fragmented network of highlands, plateaus, and vertical formations that stretch across thousands of kilometers. From the eastern plains to the Tibetan Plateau in the west, elevation rises in stages, creating layers of terrain that become progressively more difficult to access. Isolation begins with this structure. Unlike continuous mountain ranges that form predictable corridors, many of China's peaks exist as isolated systems. In regions such as Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, the terrain is not composed of connected ridgelines, but of vertical sandstone pillars separated by deep ravines. These formations create natural barriers that limit horizontal movement. Access is not simply a matter of distance, but of navigating gaps, drops, and unstable surfaces. Further west, elevation itself becomes a constraint. As terrain rises toward the Tibetan Plateau, the atmosphere thins, temperatures drop, and weather patterns become less predictable. High-altitude regions introduce physiological limits. Reduced oxygen levels, increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation, and rapid temperature fluctuations between day and night. These conditions reduce the window in which exploration can safely occur. But isolation is not only vertical. In subtropical regions, dense vegetation and complex topography restrict visibility and movement. Mountains such as Jinfo Mountain are characterized by karst landscapes, limestone formations shaped by water erosion over millions of years. Beneath the surface lies an extensive network of caves, sinkholes, and underground channels. Above ground, steep slopes and irregular terrain create a fragmented environment where paths are neither direct nor permanent. Our climate reinforces these barriers. Moist air masses moving across southern China generate persistent cloud cover in mountainous areas. Peaks are often enveloped in fog, reducing visibility to a few meters. This affects navigation, depth perception, and orientation. Landmarks disappear. Distances become difficult to judge. Movement slows, not because of physical obstruction alone, but because the environment obscures itself. Seasonal variation adds another layer. Rainfall can transform stable ground into slippery surfaces, increasing the risk of landslides. colder regions, ice forms along exposed rock faces, altering traction and making ascent significantly more dangerous. These changes are not gradual. They can occur within hours, reshaping the conditions of an entire route. Infrastructure remains limited in many of these monatic. Roads, where they exist, often follow indirect paths dictated by terrain rather than efficiency. In some areas, access points are separated by long distances, requiring extended travel through multiple environmental zones before reaching a single peak. This logistical complexity contributes to the perception and reality of remoteness. The result is a landscape where isolation is multi-layered. It is created by elevation, reinforced by geology, amplified by climate, and sustained by limited access. Each factor interacts with the others, forming a system that resists simplification. These mountains are not hidden because they are unknown. They are hidden because reaching them requires crossing a sequence of natural barriers, each one narrowing the margin for movement, and each one defining the limits of approach. Mountains formed by collision. The mountains of China are not isolated accidents of terrain. They are the visible result of forces operating deep within the Earth. Forces that have been active for tens of millions of years, reshaping entire continents through pressure, heat, and movement. At the center of this process lies a fundamental geological event, the collision between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates. Roughly 50 million years ago, the Indian plate began pushing northward into Eurasia. Unlike oceanic plates that sink beneath one another, both of these were continental, thick, buoyant, and resistant to subduction. Instead of sliding beneath, they compressed. The crust folded, fractured, and uplifted, forcing vast sections of land upward. This collision did not create a single ridge. It generated a complex system of deformation extending across much of Asia. While the Himalayas represent the most dramatic outcome, the effects propagate far into the interior of China. Layers of rock were pushed upward, tilted, and exposed to surface conditions, forming the foundation for many of the country's most distinctive mountain systems. But uplift alone does not explain their current form. Once elevated, these Sahur became subject to erosion, wind, water, temperature variation, all working over immense timescales to reshape them. The interaction between uplift and erosion defines the character of each mountain. In regions like Mount Huangshan, the dominant material is granite. Formed deep beneath the surface under intense heat and pressure, granite was later exposed as overlying layers eroded away. Over time, joints and fractures within the rock allowed water to penetrate, a freezing and expanding during temperature cycles. This process gradually separated blocks of stone, creating steep, isolated peaks and narrow ridges. The result is a landscape of sharp summits, rising above cloud layers, structures that appear sculpted, but are in fact the outcome of repeated physical stress over millions of years. Elsewhere, different materials produce entirely different forms. In southern China, areas such as Mount Danxia are composed primarily of sandstone. Unlike granite, sandstone is more susceptible to erosion. Rainfall, chemical weathering, and river activity carve into these formations, creating cliffs, valleys, and layered structures with distinct coloration. These Danxia landscapes are defined by their stratification, visible bands of sediment deposited in ancient environments, now exposed and shaped by erosion. The softer material erodes unevenly, leaving behind steep faces and isolated towers that seem precariously balanced. In other regions, limestone dominates, giving rise to karst systems. Here, water does not simply erode the surface, it dissolves the rock itself. Over time, this creates caves, sinkholes, and underground drainage networks. The surface becomes irregular, fragmented, and structurally complex, as seen in areas like Jinfo Mountain. reveal a critical principle. Mountains are not defined solely by height, but by composition. The type of rock, its internal structure, and its response to environmental forces determine how it evolves over time. And evolution is ongoing. Even now, tectonic stress continues to act beneath the surface. While movement may be slow, measured in millimeters per year, it accumulates. The fault lines shift, pressure redistributes. The landscape is never truly static. What appears solid and permanent is, in geological terms, temporary. The peaks that rise above clouds today are the result of continuous transformation, formed by collision, shaped by erosion, and sustained by forces that remain active beneath the surface. To stand on these mountains is to stand on a process, not a fixed structure. A process that began long before human presence and will continue long after. Vertical worlds, the rise of stone pillars. In certain regions of China, mountains do not form as continuous ridges or broad peaks. Instead, they rise as isolated columns, tall, narrow, and separated from one another by deep voids. These structures create landscapes that appear fragmented, almost suspended, as if disconnected from the ground itself. One of the most prominent examples exists in Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, where thousands of sandstone pillars extend upward from the forest floor. Some reach heights of over 200 meters, with vertical faces and minimal surface area at their summits. Movement between them is not straightforward. Each pillar is separated by steep drops, making lateral access difficult without artificial pathways. The formation of these structures is not sudden. It is the result of long-term erosion acting on sedimentary rock. Originally, this region consisted of a more continuous sandstone plateau. Over time, water infiltrated cracks within the rock, gradually widening them. Rainfall, combined with chemical weathering, weakened the internal structure. As erosion progressed, sections of the plateau collapsed or were worn away, and leaving behind isolated columns where the rock proved more resistant. Gravity plays a constant role in this process. Material that detaches from the pillars accumulates below, further deepening the surrounding valleys. The verticality of the landscape increases over time, not because the pillars grow taller, but because the terrain around them lowers. This creates the illusion of rising structures, when in reality, it is the surrounding allard that is receding. A similar but distinct formation can be observed in Mount Zhangjiajie, where granite, rather than sandstone, defines the landscape. Granite is more resistant to erosion, but it contains natural fractures that guide the breakdown process. Over extended periods, weathering along these fracture lines isolates large blocks, which gradually evolve into pillar-like formations. Thus, unlike sandstone, granite pillars tend to be more irregular. Their surfaces are shaped by both mechanical and chemical processes, creating rounded edges, sharp ridges, and complex contours. These formations are often described as natural sculptures, not because they are designed, but because erosion acts selectively, removing weaker material and leaving behind more stable structures. Fog and cloud cover enhance the perception of isolation. In both Zhangjiajie and Zhangjiajie, moisture-rich air frequently condenses at higher elevations, surrounding the pillars in mist. This obscures their bases, making them appear detached from the allard below. The visual effect is not a reflection of actual suspension, but of limited visibility, a reminder that perception in such environments is often incomplete. These vertical worlds introduce a unique form of inaccessibility. Unlike traditional mountains, where ascent follows a continuous path, pillar formations disrupt movement. Each structure is effectively isolated, requiring either descent into valleys or the construction of artificial bridges to connect them. Natural traversal is limited and in many cases impossible without external support. Stability is also relative. While these pillars appear solid, they are the remnants of a larger structure that has already undergone significant erosion. Their continued existence depends on the balance between material strength and environmental stress. Over time, even the most stable formations will degrade, fragment, and collapse. This process is ongoing. The landscapes seen today represent a temporary state within a longer cycle of formation and decay. What stands now will eventually be reduced, replaced by new forms shaped by the same forces. These pillar systems challenge conventional understanding of mountains. They are not continuous, not easily navigable, and not permanently stable. They exist as isolated verticality structures within a landscape defined by separation. And in that separation lies their defining characteristic. Not height alone, but isolation, each peak standing apart, shaped by time and resistant to connection. The illusion of stability. At high elevation, perception becomes unreliable. Mountains are often associated with permanence, solid rock, fixed horizons, and clearly defined boundaries. But in many of China's highland regions, what appears stable is frequently an illusion shaped by atmosphere, light, and limited visibility. On peaks such as Mount Hua, one of the most studied mountain systems in eastern China, the interaction between terrain and climate creates a constantly shifting visual environment. granite spires rise sharply from the ground, but their true scale is often obscured by dense cloud layers that form at mid-elevation. This phenomenon, commonly referred to as a sea of clouds, is not static. Warm, moist air rises from lower elevations and cools as it encounters the mountain slopes. When the air reaches its dew point, condensation occurs, forming thick layers of cloud that settle between peaks. From above, these clouds resemble a continuous surface, hiding valleys and creating the impression that summits are floating. But this visual continuity is deceptive. Beneath the cloud layer lie steep drops, fractured terrain, and uneven ground. Without clear visibility, depth perception becomes compromised. Distances are difficult to judge. A nearby ridge may be separated by a deep ravine, invisible beneath the cloud cover. Movement in such conditions requires reliance on memory, instruments, or fixed pathways rather than direct observation. Fog introduces additional complexity. Unlike stable cloud layers, fog can shift rapidly, reducing visibility to only a few meters. In these moments, orientation is lost. Landmarks disappear. The human brain, dependent on visual reference points, struggles to maintain spatial awareness. This increases the risk of missteps, particularly along narrow trails or exposed edges. Microclimates further destabilize conditions. In temperature, humidity, and wind can vary significantly within short distances. A sunlit section of a trail may transition abruptly into cold, damp conditions as it enters a shaded or cloud-covered area. These shifts affect not only comfort, but surface conditions. Rock can become slippery, and ice can form unexpectedly in colder months. Even sound behaves differently. Dense fog and irregular terrain can distort the direction and intensity of sound waves. Echoes may appear closer or farther than they are, complicating communication and further disorienting those navigating the environment. These factors combine to create a landscape where stability cannot be assumed. The ground may be solid, but the information available to interpret it is incomplete. Vision is obscured. Distances are uncertain. Yes, environmental conditions change without clear warning. Human navigation, which relies heavily on consistent sensory input, becomes less reliable under these conditions. To compensate, pathways are often constructed with fixed elements, steps carved into rock, railings, or chains, to provide physical guidance where visual cues are insufficient. These structures do not eliminate risk, but they reduce dependence on perception alone. The illusion of stability is not limited to visibility. Weather patterns themselves can create a false sense of security. Clear skies may persist for hours before rapidly giving way to cloud cover, wind, or precipitation. Without warning, conditions shift, altering the difficulty and danger of a route. In such environments, stability is not a constant state. It is a temporary alignment of conditions, visibility, our weather, and terrain, existing within a system that is inherently variable. Mount Huangshan exemplifies this dynamic. It is not only a geological structure, but an atmospheric system where air, moisture, and temperature interact continuously with the landscape. What is seen at one moment may not exist in the next. And in that uncertainty lies the challenge. Because in these mountains, the greatest obstacle is not always the terrain itself, it is the perception of it. Sacred peaks and cultural boundaries. Not all barriers are physical. Across China, many mountains are not defined solely by their height or terrain, but by the meanings assigned to them over centuries. These meanings, shaped by philosophy, religion, and tradition, create boundaries that are not enforced by geography, but by belief. One among the most significant are the sacred mountains, where human presence is guided, limited, or intentionally restrained. One such example is Mount Tai, long regarded as one of the most important peaks in Chinese history. For over 2,000 years, emperors traveled to its summit to perform rituals associated with cosmic order and legitimacy. The mountain was not simply climbed, it was approached with ceremony. Thousands of stone steps lead upward, forming a structured path through the landscape. This path reflects a key principle. Access is permitted, but controlled. Movement is directed along defined routes, limiting the impact on the surrounding environment while reinforcing the mountain's symbolic role. The ascent becomes less about reaching a physical point and more about participating in a process shaped by tradition, and a different but equally significant model exists on Mount Imei. As one of the 4 sacred Buddhist mountains of China, Imei has been a center of spiritual activity for over 2 millennia. Monasteries and temples are distributed along its slopes, often positioned in areas where natural features, cliffs, forests, and viewpoints enhance their isolation. The environment itself becomes part of the practice. Dense vegetation, mist, and elevation create a sense of separation from lowland regions. Movement through the mountain is gradual, often taking days on foot. This extended approach reinforces the transition from ordinary space to a controlled, contemplative environment. Human activity is present, but it is regulated. Construction is limited to specific zones. Natural features are preserved where possible. Wildlife, here including primates that inhabit the region, coexist within this structured environment, though not without conflict. The balance between access and preservation remains dynamic, requiring ongoing management. In the Wudang Mountains, the relationship between landscape and belief takes another form. These mountains are closely associated with Taoism, a philosophy that emphasizes harmony with natural systems. Temples are often built along ridgelines or cliff edges, integrated into the terrain, rather than imposed upon it. The placement reflects an intention to align human structures with the existing landscape. Paths connecting these sites follow the natural contours of the mountains. They are not optimized for efficiency, but for continuity, allowing movement that respects the underlying terrain. This approach reduces the need for large-scale alteration, preserving both the physical environment and its symbolic significance. In each of these cases, the mountain is not treated as an object to be conquered. It is regarded as a system to be engaged with carefully. This perspective introduces a different kind of limitation. Even where physical access is possible, cultural frameworks define what is acceptable. Certain areas may remain off-limits. Activities may be restricted. The concept of reaching a summit may be secondary to the manner in which it is approached, or whether it should be approached at all. These boundaries are maintained not through enforcement alone, but through continuity of belief. Generations pass down the understanding that certain places hold value beyond their physical form. This value shapes behavior. We're influencing how people move through the landscape and what actions are considered appropriate. In this context, inaccessibility is not always a result of danger or difficulty. It can be a choice, a deliberate decision to preserve a relationship between humans and environment, one that recognizes limits, not as obstacles, but as necessary conditions for balance. And in doing so, these sacred peaks remain partially untouched, not because they cannot be reached, but because they are not meant to be approached without restraint. The mountain no one climbs. There are mountains that resist ascent through terrain, sheer cliffs, unstable rock, unpredictable weather. And then there are mountains that remain unclimbed for a different reason entirely. In the remote western reaches of the Tibetan Plateau stands Mount Kailash, rising over 6,600 meters above sea level. Its slopes are not the highest, nor the most technically difficult when compared to other peaks in the region. By purely physical standards, a summit route is conceivable, and yet no verified ascent has ever been completed. The reason is not geological, it is cultural. Mount Kailash holds profound significance across multiple religious traditions. In Hinduism, it is considered the abode of Lord Shiva. In Buddhism, it is associated with Mount Meru, the cosmic center of the universe. In Jainism and Bon traditions, it carries its own sacred interpretations. Across these systems, the mountain is not merely a natural formation, it is a spiritual axis. Climbing it is not forbidden by physical law, but by collective understanding. Unlike other peaks where summiting represents achievement, and here it would represent violation. The idea of standing on the summit is incompatible with the meaning assigned to the mountain itself. As a result, access is redefined. The goal is not ascent, but circumambulation, a ritual journey known as Kora, where pilgrims walk a path around the mountain's base. This route spans approximately 52 kilometers, crossing high-altitude terrain and mountain passes. For many, completing a single circuit is considered spiritually significant. Some undertake multiple circuits, while others perform the journey through full-body prostrations, advancing only a few meters at a time. The process is physically demanding, but its purpose is not conquest, it is devotion. The environment reinforces the mountain's isolation. Situated at high elevation, Kailash is subject to extreme weather conditions, and temperatures fluctuate rapidly, winds intensify across exposed ridgelines, oxygen levels are reduced, increasing physical strain even during the circumferential journey. These factors limit access, but they are not the primary barrier. The primary barrier is restraint. In the modern era, there have been proposals, both scientific and exploratory, to climb the mountain. These have been consistently declined or withdrawn, often in response to cultural and religious concerns. Even in a time where most of the world's major peaks have been summited, Kailash remains outside that framework. This creates a unique category of landscape. It is not unreachable, but intentionally untouched. The distinction is significant. In most cases, inaccessibility is defined by limitation. What cannot be done due to physical constraints. Here, naught it is defined by decision, what is not done despite capability. This decision has broader implications. It demonstrates that the concept of exploration is not purely technical. It is also ethical and cultural. The ability to reach a place does not necessarily justify doing so. In certain contexts, restraint becomes part of the relationship between humans and environment. Mount Kailash embodies this principle. Its slopes remain unmarked by climbing routes. Its summit remains unseen from human perspective. And yet, it is not isolated from human presence. Thousands visit its base each year, engaging with it in a manner that aligns with its significance. The mountain stands unchanged, not because it is beyond reach, but because collectively it has been left that way. And in that decision, it represents a boundary, one defined not by nature alone, but by the limits people choose to observe, paths on the edge. In most mountainous environments, danger is defined by exposure, altitude, weather, unstable terrain. But in certain locations, risk is concentrated into narrow corridors, where a single path becomes the only connection between 2 points. These paths are not gradual ascents. They are precise routes carved into vertical space. On Mount Hua, one of China's most well-known sacred peaks, this concept is taken to its extreme. The mountain rises sharply from the surrounding landscape, its granite faces forming near vertical walls. Unlike broader pavot systems where multiple routes may exist, Mount Hua compresses movement into a limited number of pathways, some of which are only a few centimeters wide. Among these is the plank walk. This route consists of wooden boards fixed directly into the rock face, suspended hundreds of meters above the ground. There are no continuous barriers separating the path from open air. Instead, chains anchored into the cliff provide the only support. This route consists of wooden boards fixed directly into the rock face, suspended hundreds of meters above the ground. There are no continuous barriers separating the path from open air. Instead, chains anchored into the cliff provide the only support. Movement is slow, deliberate, and dependent on maintaining balance under constant exposure. The danger is not theoretical. The vertical drop beneath these paths is immediate. A loss of footing, even momentary, can result in a fall with no intermediate surface to break it. Weather conditions, wind, moisture, temperature, can further reduce stability, affecting both the surface of the path and the grip on support chains. Yet these paths were not originally constructed for recreation. Yes, they were developed as access routes to Taoist temples built along the mountain's ridges and summits. placement of these structures reflects a deliberate choice to situate places of contemplation in locations that require effort and risk to reach. The journey itself becomes part of the experience, reinforcing focus and intention. From a structural perspective, the paths represent a balance between minimal intervention and functional necessity. Rather than reshaping the mountain, the routes adapt to its existing form. Anchors are placed into rock at specific points, supporting narrow walkways that follow natural contours. This approach preserves the underlying geology, but it also limits redundancy. There are few alternative routes. Movement is constrained to the available path. This constraint amplifies psychological pressure, and exposure to height affects perception and decision-making. The human brain is not adapted to sustained movement along vertical edges. Visual cues, depth, distance, motion, become intensified, increasing stress and reducing margin for error. Even experienced individuals must actively manage attention and movement to maintain stability. At higher elevations, fatigue compounds these effects. Reduced oxygen levels combined with physical exertion can impair coordination. Hands gripping chains, feet placed on narrow surfaces, each movement requires precision. Over time, small errors become more likely, not due to lack of skill, but due to cumulative strain. Despite these risks, controlled access is maintained. Safety systems, including harness attachments, have been introduced in certain sections to reduce the likelihood of falls. However, these measures do not eliminate exposure. They mitigate consequences, but the underlying environment remains unchanged. Mount Hua illustrates a distinct category of extreme terrain. It is not defined by remoteness or inaccessibility in the traditional sense. The mountain is reachable, the paths are known, but the conditions of movement, narrow, exposed, and continuous, create a different kind of barrier. A barrier based on precision. Each step must be placed correctly. Each handhold must be secure. There is no space for deviation, no margin for distraction. The environment demands full attention, sustained over the entire route. In this context, danger is not a single event. It is a continuous condition, present at every moment of movement. And in navigating these paths, the boundary between access and risk becomes indistinguishable. A life in isolation. Isolation does not eliminate life. In many cases, it reshapes it. Across China's hidden peaks, ecosystems have developed under conditions of separation, cut off by elevation, terrain, and climate. These environments do not support large, continuous populations. Instead, they sustain specialized forms of life adapted to narrow ecological niches, where survival depends on precision rather than abundance. In regions such as Jinfo Mountain, isolation is driven by both geography and geology. The mountain's karst landscape, formed through the dissolution of limestone, creates a fragmented terrain of cliffs, caves, and sinkholes. This complexity divides habitats into smaller, semi-contained zones. Movement between these zones is limited, restricting the flow of species and genetic exchange. Over time, this can lead to localized adaptation, where organisms evolve characteristics suited to very specific conditions. Vegetation reflects this pattern. Dense forests cover much of the mountain, but their composition varies with elevation and exposure. Lower slopes support subtropical plant species, while higher altitudes introduce cooler temperatures and different soil conditions, favoring more resilient varieties. The result is a vertical layering of ecosystems, each with its own structure and biodiversity. Moisture plays a critical role. Frequent cloud cover and high humidity create conditions where water is consistently available, even in the absence of direct rainfall. The result is a vertical layering of ecosystems, each with its own structure and biodiversity. Moisture plays a critical role. Frequent cloud cover and high humidity create conditions where water is consistently available, even in the absence of direct rainfall. Mosses, ferns, and epiphytic plants, species that grow on other plants rather than in soil, thrive in these environments. They capture moisture from the air, reducing dependence on groundwater sources. Animal life adapts in parallel. Limited access and fragmented habitats reduce competition from larger predators, allowing smaller species to occupy specialized roles. Insects, amphibians, and small mammals dominate many of these ecosystems, often developing behaviors or physical traits suited to confined spaces and variable conditions. However, isolation introduces constraints. Food resources are not evenly distributed. Seasonal changes can alter availability, requiring species to adjust movement patterns or metabolic activity. reproduction may be influenced by limited interaction between populations, increasing vulnerability to environmental shifts. Similar patterns appear in other remote mountain systems. In areas with granite formations, such as Mount Sanqingshan, and vegetation clings to narrow ledges and thin soil layers. Root systems must anchor into minimal substrate, often exploiting small cracks in rock surfaces. Growth is slower, but highly adapted to stability under harsh conditions. At higher elevations, conditions become more restrictive. Lower temperatures, increased wind exposure, and reduced oxygen levels limit the range of viable species. Only those capable of tolerating these stresses, through physiological or behavioral adaptation, can persist. The ecosystem becomes less diverse, but more specialized. Isolation also provides a form of protection. Difficult access reduces human interference, allowing these ecosystems to develop with minimal external disruption. In some cases, species that have disappeared elsewhere continue to exist in these environments, preserved by the very barriers that limit access. But this protection is not absolute. Environmental changes, temperature shifts, altered precipitation patterns can affect these systems rapidly. Because they are specialized, they are also sensitive. Small changes in conditions can have disproportionate effects, disrupting the balance that sustains them. These mountain ecosystems operate at the edge of viability. They are not expansive, resilient systems. They are precise configurations of life, maintained within narrow limits. Each species, each nabat, Each interaction contributes to a balance that is both stable and fragile. In isolation, life does not expand freely. It adapts, contracts, and specializes, existing not across the landscape, but within carefully defined spaces. And in those spaces, survival is continuous, and measured not by dominance, but by persistence. Hidden systems beneath the surface. What is visible on a mountain is only part of its structure. Beneath the cliffs, pillars, and ridgelines lies a secondary landscape, one that is largely hidden, yet fundamental to the stability and evolution of the terrain above. These subsurface systems shape how mountains form, how they erode, and how they respond to environmental stress. In regions such as Mount Hua, the surface appears defined by steep red cliffs and layered rock formations. But these visible features are supported by a complex internal structure composed of sedimentary layers deposited over millions of years. Each layer differs in composition, density, and resistance to erosion. Water infiltrates these layers through fractures and porous zones, and gradually weakening the rock from within. Chemical weathering alters mineral composition, reducing structural integrity. Over time, internal cavities can develop. Zones where material has been removed or dissolved, leaving voids beneath the surface. These voids are not always stable. As erosion continues, the sough of these cavities may collapse, leading to sudden changes in the surface landscape. Cliffs can fracture, overhangs may detach, entire sections of terrain can shift without visible warning signs. The apparent solidity of the mountain is, in many cases, supported by structures that are already compromised. Karst systems represent an even more pronounced example. In limestone regions, such as those found in parts of southern China, including Jinfo Mountain, water does not merely erode, it dissolves the rock itself. Rainwater is slightly acidic due to dissolved carbon dioxide, seeps into cracks, and gradually expands them. Over time, this process creates extensive underground networks of caves, tunnels, and chambers. These systems can extend for kilometers beneath the surface. Rivers may flow entirely underground, re-emerging at distant points. Sinkholes can form when the seph of a cavern collapses, creating sudden depressions in the terrain above. In some cases, entire sections of forest or allard can subside, revealing the hollow structures beneath. From above, these processes are often invisible. The surface may appear intact, with vegetation and soil masking the underlying voids. Without detailed geological analysis, it is difficult to detect where the ground is fully supported and where it is not. This uncertainty adds another layer of complexity to navigation and development in such regions. Water plays a central role in maintaining these systems. It acts as both a shaping force and a destabilizing agent. Seasonal rainfall increases infiltration, accelerating chemical reactions and mechanical erosion. During periods of heavy precipitation, underground channels may become saturated, increasing pressure within the Hamakag and contributing to structural failure. Even in granite-dominated regions, where dissolution is less significant, internal fractures influence surface stability. Water enters these fractures, freezes in colder conditions, and expands. This repeated cycle, known as freeze-thaw weathering, gradually widens cracks, eventually separating blocks of rock from the main structure. What appears as a solid cliff face may, and over time, fragment into isolated sections. These hidden systems reveal a fundamental reality. Mountains are not solid masses. They are networks of knout, voids, and tanav, constantly interacting with environmental forces. The visible landscape is supported by structures that are dynamic, evolving, and, in many cases, fragile. Understanding these systems is essential for interpreting risk. Surface conditions alone do not determine stability. The integrity of what lies beneath plays an equally critical role. Without insight into these hidden processes, the landscape can be misread, appearing secure when it is not. In these environments, the boundary between solid and unstable is not always visible. It is embedded within the mountain itself, and it is continuously changing, weather as a barrier. In extreme mountain environments, untouched terrain is only part of the challenge. The more unpredictable and often more decisive factor is weather, an invisible system that can transform a navigable path into a hazardous zone within minutes. Across China's highland regions, atmospheric conditions act as a constant barrier, shaping not only how mountains are experienced, but whether they can be approached at all. Elevation plays a critical role. As air rises along mountain slopes, it cools rapidly, reducing its capacity to hold moisture. This leads to condensation, cloud formation, and precipitation concentrated at higher altitudes. Peaks such as Mount Hua are frequently enveloped in clouds, not because of random weather, but due to consistent atmospheric processes tied to their irtifa and location. These conditions are dynamic. Cloud layers can form, dissipate, and reform within hours. Visibility may shift from clear to near zero without warning. For those navigating narrow trails or exposed ridges, this variability introduces significant risk. A route that appears manageable in clear conditions can become disorienting when landmarks are obscured. Wind amplifies these effects. At higher elevations, air moves with fewer badhai, allowing wind speeds to increase. When wind interacts with steep terrain, it can accelerate further, creating localized gusts along ridgelines and cliff edges. These gusts are not always predictable, and their impact on balance becomes critical in areas with limited footing. Temperature fluctuations add another layer. In mountainous regions, temperature can vary significantly between day and night, as well as between sun-exposed and shaded areas. Rapid cooling in the evening can lead to the formation of ice on rock surfaces, even in seasons that are otherwise mild. This alters traction, turning stable paths into slippery surfaces. Precipitation intensifies instability. Rainfall, particularly in subtropical regions, can saturate soil and loosen a suhor. This increases the likelihood of landslides, especially on steep slopes where water accumulates quickly. In sandstone and karst environments, infiltration accelerates internal weakening, affecting both surface stability and subsurface structures. Storm systems introduce the most abrupt changes. Thunderstorms can develop rapidly, bringing heavy rain, lightning, and strong winds. In exposed areas, there is little protection from these elements. Lightning strikes become a direct hazard, and while intense rainfall reduces visibility and destabilizes footing simultaneously. Even in the absence of storms, humidity affects movement. High moisture levels can create condensation on surfaces, making rocks and pathways slick. Combined with fog, this reduces both friction and visibility, two critical factors for safe navigation. Weather also influences decision-making. Uncertainty about changing conditions requires constant assessment. Delays, route changes, or retreat may become necessary based on atmospheric shifts rather than terrain alone. In many cases, weather determines the practical limit of exploration more than physical obstacles. These patterns are not random. They are governed by predictable processes, airflow, temperature gradients, moisture content, but their outcomes are variable in time and space. This makes precise forecasting at a local level difficult, particularly in complex terrain. In mountains, weather is not a background condition. It is an active force. It shapes the environment, alters the terrain, and defines the window in which human movement is possible. Without it, many routes would be straightforward. With it, even familiar paths become uncertain. And unlike rock or elevation, it cannot be fixed or controlled, only anticipated and respected. Human limits in extreme terrain. There is a point at which environment stops being a challenge and becomes a constraint. In extreme mountain terrain, this boundary is defined not by skill or equipment alone, but by the physiological and cognitive limits of the human body. Across China's high peaks, these limits are encountered in layers. At higher elevations, and the most immediate factor is oxygen availability. As altitude increases, atmospheric pressure decreases, reducing the amount of oxygen that can be absorbed with each breath. Even moderate irtifa can produce measurable effects: shortness of breath, increased heart rate, and fatigue. As elevation continues to rise, these effects intensify. The body attempts to compensate by increasing respiration and circulation, but this adaptation has limits. Oxygen saturation in the blood declines, affecting brain function. Decision-making slows, reaction time increases. Tasks that require coordination, such as navigating narrow paths or adjusting footing, become more difficult. These changes are gradual, but cumulative. Fatigue builds not only from physical exertion, but from reduced efficiency at the cellular level. Muscles receive less oxygen and producing energy less effectively. Movement becomes slower, and recovery between efforts is reduced. On mountains such as Mount Hua, where routes are already constrained, this reduction in performance has direct consequences. The terrain demands precision. Narrow pathways, vertical exposure, and limited handholds require controlled movement. Under normal conditions, these demands are manageable with focus and technique. Under physiological stress, the margin for error narrows. Psychological factors further influence performance. Exposure to height triggers instinctive responses. The human brain is not adapted to sustained movement along vertical edges. Visual perception of depth activates caution, sometimes leading to hesitation or overcorrection. In controlled amounts, this response enhances safety. Under prolonged exposure, it can lead to fatigue, stress, and impaired judgment. Isolation compounds these effects. In remote sections of mountainous terrain, assistance is not immediate. The awareness of limited external support influences behavior, increasing cognitive load. Attention must be divided between movement, environment, and risk assessment, all while managing physical strain. Weather interacts with these limits. Wind reduces stability. Cold affects muscle function and dexterity. Moisture alters traction. Each environmental factor increases the demand placed on the body, requiring additional energy and concentration to maintain control. becomes a critical variable. Extended exposure to high-risk conditions increases cumulative fatigue. Even if each individual movement is controlled, the probability of error rises over time. This is not due to a single failure. But to the gradual decline in performance as physical and mental resources are depleted. Training and experience can extend these limits, but not eliminate them. Adaptation allows individuals to function more effectively under stress, but it does not remove the underlying constraints. The body continues to operate within defined physiological boundaries, regardless of expertise. These limits explain why certain routes remain rarely attempted. It is not always the difficulty of the terrain alone, but the sustained demand placed on the human system. A path may be technically possible, but only within a narrow window of optimal conditions: physical, environmental, and temporal. Beyond that window, the balance shifts. Control becomes harder to maintain. Risk increases. The environment does not change, but the capacity to navigate it does. In extreme terrain, success is not defined by reaching a destination. It is defined by maintaining control within a system that continuously reduces it, and recognizing when that control begins to diminish. Preservation through inaccessibility. Not all environments require active protection to remain intact. In many cases, preservation emerges as a consequence of difficulty, where terrain, climate, and isolation limit human interference more effectively than regulation alone. Across China's hidden peaks, inaccessibility functions as a natural form of conservation. In regions such as Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, the vertical structure of the landscape restricts large-scale development. The sandstone pillars are separated by deep ravines and dense vegetation, and making construction logistically complex and economically impractical beyond designated zones. As a result, much of the area remains undisturbed. Where access is possible, it is often concentrated. Paths, bridges, and viewing platforms are built in specific locations, directing movement along controlled routes. This limits the spatial footprint of human activity, reducing erosion, vegetation loss, and habitat disruption in surrounding areas. The landscape remains largely intact, not because it is untouched, but because interaction is contained. A similar pattern exists in biologically rich environments such as Jinfo Mountain. The karst terrain, with its caves and uneven surfaces, discourages widespread infrastructure. Movement is naturally confined to certain corridors, leaving large sections of forest and jebel ecosystems relatively undisturbed. These conditions allow biodiversity to persist, including species that are sensitive to habitat fragmentation. Isolation also reduces resource extraction. Inaccessible terrain increases the cost and complexity of activities such as logging, mining, and large-scale agriculture. While not eliminating these pressures entirely, it limits their reach. Areas that are difficult to enter are often the last to be altered, preserving ecological processes that have disappeared elsewhere. Cultural factors reinforce this effect. In sacred mountain systems, including Mount Hua, access is guided by long-standing traditions. Development is constrained not only by physical limitations, but by the need to maintain the integrity of the site. Structures are integrated carefully, and large-scale alteration is avoided. This combination of physical and cultural boundaries creates layered protection. However, Preservation through inaccessibility is not absolute. Advances in technology, transportation, construction methods, and tourism infrastructure have begun to reduce the barriers that once limited access. Cable cars, stairways, and engineered pathways extend human presence into areas that were previously unreachable. While these developments increase accessibility, they also introduce new pressures. Increased foot traffic can accelerate erosion. Vegetation may be damaged or removed, wildlife can be displaced by noise and human activity. Even controlled access requires continuous management to prevent gradual degradation of the environment. Balancing access and preservation becomes a central challenge. Complete isolation is not always feasible or desirable. Many of these landscapes hold cultural, scientific, and ecological value that benefits from responsible exploration. The question is not whether they should be accessed, but how. In this context, inaccessibility is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary state shaped by current limitations. As those limitations change, so does the level of protection they provide. These mountains illustrate an important principle. Preservation is not solely the result of intention. It can emerge from constraint, where the difficulty of reaching a place limits the extent to which it is altered. But as those constraints weaken, preservation must transition from passive to active. From being a byproduct of isolation to a deliberate choice. And in that transition lies the future of these environments. the changing balance. For most of their existence, China's hidden peaks have evolved slowly, shaped by geological forces operating over millions of years. Change was gradual, often imperceptible within a human lifetime. But in recent decades, that balance has begun to shift. Not because the mountains themselves have changed, but because the conditions surrounding them have. Climate is one of the most influential variables. Temperature increases, even by a few degrees, alter multiple systems simultaneously. In higher elevations, where seasonal ice and frost play a role in stabilizing rock, warming trends reduce the duration and intensity of freezing conditions. This changes the cycle of expansion and contraction within fractures, affecting how rock breaks down over time. In some cases, reduced ice formation decreases certain types of weathering. In others, increased moisture penetrates deeper into rock structures, accelerating chemical processes. The result is not uniform. Different regions respond differently, depending on their composition and climate. Granite formations such as those on Mount Hua may experience gradual shifts in erosion patterns, while sandstone and karst systems, already more sensitive, can respond more rapidly to changes in rainfall and temperature. Precipitation patterns are also evolving. In some areas, rainfall is becoming more concentrated, shorter periods of intense precipitation rather than steady distribution. This increases surface runoff, which accelerates erosion and destabilizes slopes. In steep terrain, even small increases in runoff can trigger landslides or weaken already fractured rock. overcast environments are particularly vulnerable. On mountains like Jinfo Mountain, where water interacts directly with soluble rock, changes in rainfall intensity affect both surface and subsurface systems. Increased infiltration can expand underground cavities more quickly, raising the risk of collapse in areas that previously remained stable. Vegetation patterns are shifting as well. Temperature and moisture influence the distribution of plant species across elevation zones. As conditions change, certain species may expand into higher altitudes, while others retreat. This alters root structures within the soil, affecting how well slopes are anchored. Vegetation is not just a biological component. It plays a structural role in stabilizing terrain. So in colder regions, glacial systems, where present, are retreating. Although less prominent than in other parts of Asia, glacial reduction still influences water availability and seasonal flow patterns. Meltwater contributes to river systems and affects soil saturation. Changes in these patterns can impact both ecosystems and surface stability. Human activity amplifies these changes. Increased tourism, infrastructure development, and environmental pressure introduce additional variables. Paths widen, surfaces compact, drainage patterns are altered. Even small-scale interventions, when repeated over time, can influence how water moves through a landscape and how erosion progresses. These effects are cumulative. Individually, each change may appear minor. Together, They shift the balance that has maintained these environments over long periods. Systems that were once stable under specific conditions begin to respond differently as those conditions evolve. Importantly, these changes do not make the mountains disappear. They transform them. Cliffs may recede. Pillars may collapse or fragment. Vegetation zones may relocate. The landscape remains, but its structure and dynamics adjust to new variables. This transformation introduces uncertainty. Patterns that were once predictable, seasonal weather, erosion rates, ecological distribution, become less consistent. For those who study or navigate these environments, historical knowledge becomes less reliable as a guide to future conditions. The hidden peaks are not static monuments. They are active systems, continuously responding to internal and external forces. Climate change does not create new processes. It alters the intensity and interaction of existing ones, and in doing so, it shifts the thresholds that define stability. The question is not whether these landscapes will endure. They will. The question is how they will change, and whether those changes will preserve the conditions that have kept them isolated, balanced, and largely untouched. Because once that balance shifts beyond a certain point, the nature of these peaks may be altered in ways that cannot be reversed. The meaning of untouched places. Exploration has long been associated with progress. The idea that to reach a place is to understand it, and to understand it is to claim a form of mastery. Maps expand, routes are established, as and unknown regions become known through repeated access. But in certain landscapes, this framework begins to shift. China's hidden peaks challenge the assumption that every place must be reached to be understood. In environments shaped by difficulty, isolation, and cultural meaning, the act of not intervening becomes as significant as exploration itself. Mountains such as Mount Kailash illustrate this distinction clearly. Its summit remains physically accessible in theory, yet untouched in practice. This is not due to a lack of capability, but to a collective decision that the value of the mountain lies not in its conquest, but in its preservation. The absence of ascent is not a gap in exploration, it is an intentional boundary. This introduces a different relationship between humans and landscape. Instead of measuring success by proximity or control, value is assigned through distance and restraint. The mountain is engaged with, observed, and respected, but not altered. Its significance is maintained by limiting interaction rather than expanding it. Similar principles apply in varying degrees across other peaks. On Mount Tai, access is structured and ceremonial. Movement is guided along specific routes, reinforcing a controlled relationship with the environment. On Wudang Mountains, human structures are integrated into the terrain, aligning with its natural form rather than reshaping it. These approaches reflect an underlying concept that certain environments hold value beyond their physical characteristics. cultural, spiritual, and historical meanings influence how these places are approached, and whether they should be approached at all. From a scientific perspective, untouched environments also offer unique opportunities. They function as reference systems, areas where natural processes continue with minimal external interference. Studying such locations allows researchers to observe ecological and geological dynamics in a state closer to their natural baseline. This provides insight into how systems operate without the influence of large-scale human activity. But preservation is not only scientific or cultural, it is also philosophical. The existence of places that remain partially or entirely untouched challenges the idea that access equates to understanding. It suggests that some aspects of the natural world retain value precisely because they are not fully integrated into human systems. This does not imply exclusion. People continue to visit, observe, and interact with these environments. But the nature of that interaction is defined by limits, boundaries that maintain the integrity of the landscape while allowing for engagement. In this context, untouched does not mean unknown. It means unaltered. A distinction that becomes increasingly significant as technological capability expands. As access becomes easier, the decision to limit that access becomes more deliberate. These mountains represent that decision. They are not beyond reach. They are beyond certain forms of use. And in that distinction lies a different definition of exploration, one that includes not only the ability to go further, but the judgment to stop. Because understanding a place does not always require standing at its highest point. Sometimes it requires recognizing why that point remains untouched. The edge of exploration. Throughout history, the boundary of exploration has been defined by capability. As tools improved and knowledge expanded, previously inaccessible regions became reachable. Mountains were mapped, summits were climbed, and isolation gradually diminished. But in landscapes such as China's hidden peaks, that boundary is no longer defined solely by what is possible. It is defined by what remains appropriate. Technological advancement continues to reduce physical barriers. Modern equipment allows for more precise navigation, improved safety, and extended endurance in extreme conditions. Infrastructure, roads, cable systems, unengineered pathways can transform once remote areas into accessible destinations within years. Yet each extension of access introduces a corresponding shift. The environment changes in response. Surfaces wear under repeated use. Vegetation recedes along frequently traveled routes. Wildlife adapts or withdraws. The landscape, once defined by isolation, begins to reflect patterns of movement and presence. In regions like Zhangjiajie National Forest Park, controlled development has made certain areas accessible while leaving others largely untouched. This selective access represents an evolving model, one that attempts to balance visibility with preservation. But the balance is not static. As demand increases, pressure to expand access grows. New routes, new viewpoints, new infrastructure. Each addition alters the system. The question becomes not whether access is possible, but how much change the environment can absorb before its defining characteristics are altered. This tension is particularly visible in places where cultural significance intersects with physical accessibility. On Mount Hua, safety systems have been introduced to reduce risk along exposed paths. These interventions make the environment more navigable. But they also shift its original condition. The mountain remains dangerous, but the nature of that danger is modified. In contrast, peaks such as Mount Kailash remain protected through non-physical boundaries. Here, the limit is not imposed by terrain or technology, but by collective agreement. The absence of development preserves both the physical landscape and its symbolic meaning. It represents a boundary that cannot be overcome through engineering. These differing approaches highlight a broader transition. Exploration is no longer a process of continuous expansion. It has reached a point where limits must be defined, not by inability, but by intention. The capacity to reach a place now exists in many cases. The decision lies in whether that capacity should be exercised. This introduces a new dimension to exploration, one that includes responsibility. The ability to alter an environment carries with it the question of consequence. Each action, each path created, each structure built, has an effect that extends beyond its immediate purpose. Over time, these effects accumulate, reshaping the very landscapes that made exploration significant. China's hidden peaks exist at this intersection. They are environments where natural forces have created complexity. where cultural systems have defined boundaries and where modern capability is testing those limits. Some remain isolated through difficulty, others through decision. Together, they define the current edge of exploration. Not a fixed line, but a shifting threshold, where physical possibility meets ethical consideration, and where the future of these landscapes depends on how that threshold is understood. Because the question is no longer how far exploration can go. It is how far it should, 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 is how